action.
All right, guys, we're back for vlog number 6. I think 7, maybe. Who knows?
We've done this 6 times.
Yeah, it's been a few.
That's pretty wild.
We just finished our big coding project, the thermonuclear code, and it was a pretty interesting experience. I really struggled a lot of times, a lot of different nights where because with like a math exercise, I feel like I can always find the answer, but with coding, it's like even if I Google what I need, it's still hard for me to like put it into it. So it's definitely quite a challenge, and we hit a lot of roadblocks. But in the end, I think our game turned out pretty well. I don't know. How did you feel about it?
Yeah. I mean, I reiterate everything he said. There were a lot of roadblocks, and looking online is helpful to an extent. But if you don't know what you're looking for,
exactly, yeah.
It makes it that much harder because you have to figure out what is going to help you and then how to implement that. And a lot of times it was just hard to really articulate exactly what I was trying to get from something. I mean, I ran into a lot of problems with, really just came down to being able to access things in the correct way, because what would end up happening is like, I wouldn't be sure, and I know I worked on this with you, Dondi, at one point. It was like I was doing the correct thing. I was setting the correct like status of somebody in the dictionary, like a character in the dictionary, but I wasn't printing the thing that would show me exactly what I was doing. So in effect, I was doing it right, but I wasn't printing it, and so I was constantly trying to figure out what was going on wrong. And so, I mean, kind of roadblocks like that, especially when you're like on your own, is a little more.
Yeah, that's definitely tough.
Yeah, because like, I mean, you're just kind of sitting there and you're like, okay, I'll go back through it.
And also, you don't have anyone to vent to.
Yeah,
like, I would just yell at Charles.
Well,
it sucks, man.
Luckily, I had Haley, and she was very helpful a lot of times. But no, there weren't a lot of times where I would be working and she would, want to help me out with that, because she has her own stuff as well.
Right.
But I mean, that she helped like 40% of the time.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, coding is one of those things that, and this was very apparent with this assignment, is like you can't just do it all in one sitting because of the, how large the program is, but also like, I mean, my program, like even after I turned it in, wasn't, essentially you go through a round and then 2 cards would be played because something was up. And I just, I was like, all right, whatever, it's fine.
That's kind of how we do it too.
And then like a day later, I went in to the REPL and was like, oh, I just need an else statement, and put all that in a chunk. And it's like, it's little things like that. You get it's almost like when you say a word a bunch of times and then it starts to sound weird. Like that's kind of how it felt.
We definitely had a similar problem with like overcomplicating things. Just because like our first initial problem that we had was that we would print our location name, but it wouldn't print the description, and the description like wouldn't follow the location name. And we literally were missing 1 line of code, but for the last like 2 days, me and Charles had been putting in like new like 30-line loops, and then Dondi was like, "Oh, you just need to add this line here," and that's it.
Yeah,
it's kind of crazy.
But it's good. It's a good learning experience, and I mean, yeah, I wish I could have added more like flair to the project, but at the same time, like, I've got a lot of projects for other classes that I've got going on, so I'm glad that I was able to just even do something as simple as get what I had there. But yeah,
I think it's tough because this is only semester-long class, and I think if we had the opportunity to like really learn the language for like, I don't know, like the entirety of like high school, even like something like that, where you had a huge background on it, and then you learned like individual commands first, rather than learning how to code an entire game, which isn't obviously possible in this sort of a class, but it'd be interesting to get a separate like experience that way. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that one project was so much more of a learning experience for me than my 2 years of coding in high school, just because this particular program brought in so many different things that we learned, like with loops and with data structures and kind of that inherent logic to everything, I feel like I could add more flair to it, just given more time and just being able to kind of have more checkpoints. Like I think, a suggestion like for something like this, like it might be helpful to have those, first two turn-ins be like still working things, and then have a third one. It's like if you want to add more, like, more bells and whistles to it, like an extra credit thing or like part of an assignment. I don't know.
Right. It is tough too because I feel like for me, if I had had access to like a tutor the whole time, that would have been amazing. And obviously, Dondi, you have all 15 of us that you have to attend to every class. So it's difficult to ask all the questions you have when you have them. And so I kept forgetting what I wanted answered. Anyway, let's talk about the Alan Turing article. So we read that Alan Turing article on whether or not machines can think. And it was kind of cool how, obviously, it was written in 1950, I think. And I really liked how none of the modern computer language or anything like that was in it. And it was cool to see how he thought of computers in that old-time standpoint, I guess.
Yeah, kind of like you said in class, it is like a psychology paper. Like the first paragraph reads exactly like a philosophy psychology paper, and it's like we need to define the things that we're talking about before we can even talk about them. And that idea of thinking, like what is thinking, what is a machine, I think it's really important, and you see it, in something like global new the game, whatever it was called, because I had like AI or whatever, but that was just based on random chance, and it as more like AI becomes sophisticated and kind of along that sense, it becomes, I don't know, like increasingly obvious to me that it's like, the computer, the program isn't doing anything that you're not telling it to do. And I think that's what's really, I think, pertinent, especially like in regards to the article, because it kind of iterates that idea of, the computer is trying to, in that experiment, it was the computer trying to figure out if it was like X was a man and like Y was a woman, right?
Yeah.
And like that kind of stuff is like the only way that it can know is if you tell it what a man or a woman is.
Yeah.
And yeah, I thought that was super interesting, and it's funny, like with the game, you have everything planned out in your head and you understand what it means, but the computer doesn't. And so when you have to like, explain kind of what you're thinking and how to get that sort of similar process into the computer, like it makes it just that much more crazy, I think, when you think of computer science or computing like from the ground up. Is really like, you have to define everything.
Like, especially in that age where Alan Turing was writing this, like the progression of computers from there just is mind-boggling to me, that they, even to create like a language like Python, just like you said, defining every single thing that the computer does. One point I really liked of his, in terms of like the potential for creating artificial intelligence, was that you don't necessarily have to code like a super advanced intelligence, and he made the analogy of like a child's brain, and if you can create like the equivalent of child's brain, then over the course of several years, like you would with the regular child, as long as within the code is the potential for growth, then you can grow that child's brain, artificial intelligence, into something much greater, which is super crazy. Like, it's so wild.
It's almost like you're talking in class kind of about, I think it was in reference to Quinn's program or other programs too. It's like you want the core kind of program of the game to stay similar, but what you want is data structures that allow it to change based on like the data that you have. And I think that's kind of the way that you'd be able to program like, a child's brain or whatever. Like you would have those kind of core things going on, but then the influx of data coming in that changes things along the way.
Yeah, I've been kind of looking at like machine learning recently, and I think it's so trippy that like the computer it's like a base code and then it evolves itself. I saw one today where it had the base code for like a base human anatomy, and then it taught itself to walk like the same way a child would.
Yeah, have you seen those robots?
Right, exactly. Yeah. I don't know.
So
It's just
funny.
there's so much potential for because as soon as you make a computer that can grow, the possibilities are endless.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
I also don't subscribe to the whole like computers are gonna kill us
Right.
sort of thing.
I mean,
I don't know. It seems we can talk about it more in class. It just seems like kind of naive and not
right. I mean,
Yeah, I think
yeah.
it's almost like that older generation sort of.
Yeah, it's like a fear of aliens. It's like
Yeah, it's just like
we could make it and it could kill us, but like it doesn't seem like
Yeah.
it. I don't
it also comes down to regulations. I mean, this is a tangent, but yeah, no, I think it's a cool article, especially after we've coded something like the game because it kind of puts everything back into perspective of what we're doing, and it's nice to have sort of those like theory things like alongside the coding because I feel like you can get lost in a for loop and why
right.
for character in person dot items isn't printing the status. You can't figure it out, but it's helpful to kind of be able to take that step back and realize that you are trying to create this thought process, and viewing it that way makes it, I don't know, easier to kind of approach because once you think of it as a thought process, it stops becoming lines of code that should do things and it becomes more of like a fluid sort of.
One fluid.
Just
idea,
thought.
A means to an end.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good way to think about it. Well, I guess we'll call it there, and we'll see you guys next week for more vlogs.